Hello dear listeners and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. Edward here, so glad you've joined me again. Tell me, what's your favourite warm drink to enjoy while listening to these mysteries? Tea, cocoa, or perhaps a cosy cup of coffee? I love hearing about the small comforts that make your evening special, and of course do subscribe if you haven't already. Now, get comfortable. The mystery awaits. Chapter 1. The arrival of the improvement consultant. The sleet came down like frozen needles on the village of Lochdoub, driven by a vicious wind straight off the Atlantic. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the kitchen window of the police station, watching the grey sheets of rain sweep across the loch, and reflected that it was a grand day for staying indoors. He was a tall, thin man with hazel eyes and red hair, and at that moment he was contemplating the virtues of doing absolutely nothing. Outside, his small flock of sheep huddled miserably against the stone wall, their fleeces dark with moisture. Hamish sighed and reached for his oilskin coat. The sheep would need checking, promotion to detective or no promotion to detective. His dog Lugs, a mongrel with blue eyes and ears like satellite dishes, looked up hopefully from his position by the stove. "Aye, you can come," said Hamish, "but you'll not like it." Lugs thumped his tail in agreement and followed his master to the door. Sonsi, the wild cat that Hamish had somehow domesticated through patience and offerings of fresh fish, merely opened one amber eye from her position on the armchair, assessed the weather, and went back to sleep. The wind hit Hamish like a fist as he stepped outside. He pulled his cap down firmly and headed toward the field, Lugs trotting reluctantly at his heels. The sheep were fine, as he had known they would be. Highland sheep were tougher than any London consultant, which brought his mind inevitably to the problem currently afflicting the village. Quentin Vane had arrived 3 days earlier in a Range Rover so new it still had the plastic on the seats, and had managed in that short time to insult every crofter, farmer and fisherman within a 10-mile radius. He was an agricultural efficiency consultant, or so his business cards proclaimed, hired by Lord Strathmore, an absentee landlord who lived in Surrey and had never set foot in the Highlands in his life. Vane's mission was simple and devastating. He was to modernise the local croft, streamline production, and most controversially, demolish the old Angus barn to make way for a prefabricated processing unit that looked, in the artist's renderings Vane had gleefully displayed at the public meeting, like a corrugated iron box. The old Angus barn had stood for 200 years. It was a low stone building with a slate roof, built by hand when the village was young. Every crofter had stored hay there at one time or another. Children had played in its shadowy interior. Courting couples had stolen kisses behind its thick walls. It was in short a part of Lochdoub's very soul, and Quentin Vane wanted to bulldoze it. Hamish had attended the meeting in the village hall 2 nights previous, and had watched the explosion of Highland fury with the detached interest of a man who knew better than to get between a Highlander and his heritage. Vane had stood at the front of the hall, a stocky man in his 40s with thinning hair and an unfortunate braying laugh, and told the assembled villagers that they were living in the past. "Sentiment doesn't pay the bills," he had announced, his English accent grating on every Scottish ear in the room. "This barn is a liability, inefficient, outdated. Lord Strathmore has been more than patient with you people, but the time has come for progress." Archie MacLean, the fisherman, had risen from his seat with fists clenched. "You people? We're not people to you, are we? Just numbers on a spreadsheet." "If the cap fits," Vane had said with a smirk. It had taken the Reverend Wellington and Dr. Brodie working together to prevent actual violence. Even then the air had crackled with rage. The only person who had attempted any sort of diplomacy was Elspeth Menzies, the village archivist and part-time librarian. She was a small, neat woman in her late 30s with soft brown hair and gentle grey eyes. She had risen timidly from her seat and suggested, in a voice that trembled slightly, that perhaps Mr. Vane would like to see the historical documents relating to the barn before making his final decision. "History is just that. History," Vane had snapped. "This is about the future, Miss Menzies, though I suppose you wouldn't understand that buried in your dusty books." Elspeth had flushed scarlet but said nothing more. After the meeting, she had quietly moved through the hall, serving tea and offering soft words of comfort. She had even brought Hamish a basket the following morning, filled with fresh scones still warm from the oven. "You must be frozen in this weather, Constable," she had said with a shy smile. "I thought these might help." Hamish had thanked her warmly. Elspeth was one of those rare souls who seemed to think of everyone but herself. She had lived in Lochdoub all her life, quietly tending to the village's archives, organising the library's collection, and helping anyone who needed it. She was so polite, so self-effacing, that Hamish sometimes forgot she was there until she appeared with exactly what was needed. Now, as he trudged back through the sleet toward the warmth of the police station, Hamish wondered what would happen next. Vane had made it clear he would begin work on Monday, with or without the villagers' blessing. That gave them 3 days. 3 days for tempers to cool or for something worse to happen. Hamish shook his head and opened the door. Lugs rushed past him toward the fire, shaking water everywhere. Sonsie opened one eye in reproach. "Aye, I know," Hamish told the cat. "But a policeman's work is never done, even if he tries his best to avoid it." He hung up his oilskin and put the kettle on. Outside, the sleet continued to fall, and somewhere in the village Quentin Vane was no doubt making more enemies. Hamish could only hope that Highland common sense would prevail. But in his experience, hope was often a poor substitute for vigilance. And vigilance, he reflected glumly as he settled into his armchair with a cup of tea, was exactly what he had been trying to avoid. The wind howled around the police station like a banshee, and Hamish Macbeth, that most reluctant of policemen, resigned himself to keeping one eye on the village, whether he wanted to or not. After all, he thought, reaching down to scratch lugs behind one ridiculous ear, somebody had to make sure things didn't get out of hand, and that somebody, through no fault of his own, appeared to be him. The sleet turned to rain as darkness fell, drumming on the roof like impatient fingers. Somewhere in Lochdoub, Quentin Vane slept soundly, unaware that he had lit a fuse, and somewhere in the darkness that fuse was burning steadily down. Chapter 2. The Burning Light in the Dark. Hamish was dreaming of a promotion ceremony in which Detective Chief Inspector Blair presented him with a medal that turned into a ball and chain when the telephone shrilled him awake. He groped for the receiver in the darkness, knocking over a glass of water in the process. "Macbeth," he mumbled, squinting at the illuminated hands of the clock. 4:30 in the morning. Nothing good ever happened at 4:30 in the morning. "Constable, it's Rory Sinclair." The shepherd's voice was tight with anxiety. "You'd best come out to the old Angus barn. There's something not right." Hamish was suddenly wide awake. "What is it?" "There's a light burning inside. A lantern by the look of it. Been there for hours now. I saw it on my way down from the high pasture just after midnight. Thought nothing of it. But it's still burning, and there's been no movement at all." "I'll be there in 10 minutes, said Hamish, already swinging his legs out of bed. He dressed quickly, pulling on his uniform and oilskin. The rain had stopped, but a thick mist had rolled in from the loch, blanketing everything in a grey shroud. Lugs looked at him reproachfully from the bed, clearly of the opinion that 4:30 was an ungodly hour for anyone to be about. "Stay," Hamish commanded, and the dog settled back down with a martyred sigh. The drive to the barn took him through the sleeping village, past darkened cottages and the silent harbour, where fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings. The mist was so thick he could barely see 20 feet ahead. When he finally pulled up beside the old Angus barn, where Rory's battered Land Rover was already there, the shepherd himself a bulky shadow in the fog. "I haven't gone inside," Rory said. "Didn't he seem right to, somehow?" Hamish could see what he meant. Through the gaps in the barn's old wooden door, a warm golden light flickered. It should have been welcoming. Instead, it looked wrong, like a candle burning in a tomb. He pushed open the door. The lantern sat on an upturned crate, its flame steady and bright, and beside it, sprawled on the earthen floor like a broken puppet, lay Quentin Vane. Hamish moved forward carefully, though he knew already what he would find. Vane's eyes were open and staring, his mouth frozen in an expression of surprise. A pool of blood had spread beneath his head, dark and viscous in the lamplight. Nearby, an antique cast-iron peat cutter lay on the ground, its edge dark with blood. "Dear God," breathed Rory from the doorway. "Don't come in," Hamish said sharply, "and don't touch anything." He knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. Vane's skin was cold, his limbs already stiffening. Dead for several hours at least. The blow to the skull had been devastating, a single strike from behind that had caved in the back of the man's head. But it was the lantern that held Hamish's attention. It hadn't been dropped or knocked over in a struggle. It had been placed there, carefully and deliberately, as if the killer wanted the body to be found, or wanted to make a point. Hamish pulled out his mobile phone and called the station at Strathbane. Then he stood guard over the scene, noting every detail. The barn was largely empty, just some old farm equipment and stacked hay bales. No sign of a struggle, no indication that Vane had fought back. He had been struck down quickly, efficiently, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The mist was beginning to lift when Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived, accompanied by a small army of detectives and forensics officers. Blair was a fat, red-faced man who reeked of whiskey even at this early hour. He took one look at Hamish and scowled. "Well, well," he said with malicious satisfaction. "Murder on your patch, Macbeth. That'll not look good on your record, will it?" "The man was killed some time after midnight," Hamish said evenly. "I was asleep in my bed, as any sensible person would be." "Aye, asleep while murder was being done," Blair's bloodshot eyes gleamed. "Typical. Well, stand aside, man. Let the real detectives do their work." Hamish stepped back and watched as Blair's team descended on the barn like locusts. The scene, which Hamish had carefully preserved, was soon churned into chaos by too many feet and careless handling. Blair himself stood in the centre, barking orders and looking important. "This'll be one of the locals," Blair announced loudly. "Mark my words, that consultant fellow made plenty of enemies. Probably half the village wanted him dead." "That's a bit of a leap," Hamish began, but Blair cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Don't try to protect your wee village, Macbeth. I know how these places work. Probably some crofter whose pride got hurt. Well, we'll have them in custody by nightfall, you mark my words." As the sun rose, burning away the last of the mist, more villagers began to appear. News travelled fast in Lochdu, faster than any modern communication. By 8 o'clock a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, watching the police activity with worried faces. Elspeth Menzies was among them, her face pale beneath her brown hair. When she saw Hamish, she hurried over, a thermos flask clutched in her hands. "Oh, Constable Macbeth, how awful," she said, her voice trembling. "Is it true? Is Mr. Vane really dead?" "I'm afraid so, Elspeth." "But who would do such a thing?" Her grey eyes were wide with shock. "I mean, I know he wasn't popular, but murder—" She trailed off, seemingly unable to finish the thought. Then, with the natural kindness that characterised her, she held out the thermos. "I brought coffee for the officers from Strathbane. They must be frozen, poor things. And I thought you might need some too." "That's very thoughtful of you," Hamish said, accepting a cup gratefully. The coffee was hot and strong, exactly what he needed. Elspeth lingered, twisting her hands together nervously. "Do you think... could it have been an accident? Perhaps he fell and hit his head?" "I don't think so," Hamish said carefully, "but it's early days yet." Blair emerged from the barn, spotted Elspeth, and lumbered over with surprising speed for a man of his bulk. He had the predatory look of a man who had found a useful witness. "Miss Menzies, is it?" he said, his tone falsely jovial. "I understand you were at the meeting the other night. The one where the deceased made such a stir." "Yes, that's right." Elspeth's voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you notice anyone particularly angry? Anyone who made threats?" "Oh, well, everyone was upset, really, but I wouldn't say anyone made actual threats. It was more general displeasure." Blair pulled out a notebook. I'll need names. Everyone who was there. Everyone who argued with the victim. Of course, Chief Inspector, I can make you a list if that would help. I was taking notes for the village council minutes. Perfect. Blair beamed at her as if she had just solved the case. Bring it to me at the station, and anything else you remember. Every little detail could be important. After Blair had stumped back to the barn, issuing more unnecessary orders, Elspeth turned to Hamish. Her hands were shaking as she poured more coffee. I feel terrible, she said quietly, making a list of my neighbours, as if they were criminals. But I suppose I have to help the police. Or don't I? You're doing the right thing, Hamish assured her, though something about the situation made him uneasy. Blair had seized on Elspeth's helpfulness with too much enthusiasm, and Hamish knew from bitter experience that the detective's first theory was usually the wrong one. As the day wore on, the forensics team worked methodically through the barn. Hamish, relegated to crowd control, watched from a distance and thought. The killing had been carefully planned. The killer had known where to find Vane, had brought the weapon, and had arranged the scene with theatrical precision. The lantern was the key, he was certain of it. But what did it mean? By late afternoon, Elspeth returned with a neatly typed list of everyone who had attended the meeting, complete with brief notes on their interactions with Vane. Blair accepted it with the satisfaction of a cat presented with cream. Excellent work, Miss Menzies. This will help us enormously. As she left, Hamish noticed that her hands were no longer shaking. She looked calm, composed, almost serene. It was remarkable, he thought, how quickly she had recovered from the shock. Remarkable, and perhaps worth thinking about. The sun was setting when Blair finally allowed Hamish back into the barn. The body had been removed, but the bloodstain remained, a dark shadow on the earth floor. The lantern, now cold and empty, sat where it had been found. Simple case, Blair announced, lighting a cigarette. Find out which of these yokels had the biggest grievance, check their alibi, and Bob's your uncle. We'll have this wrapped up in no time. Hamish said nothing. He had learned long ago that arguing with Blair was as productive as talking to the sheep. Instead, he studied the scene once more, committing every detail to memory, because he had a feeling that this case would be anything but simple, and that lantern, burning through the night, was trying to tell him something important. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. The following morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the heather like scattered diamonds. Hamish fed his animals and made himself a substantial breakfast of bacon, eggs, and black pudding, knowing from experience that detective work was best conducted on a full stomach. Blair had commandeered the interview room at the Strathbane station, which meant that Hamish was officially shut out of the investigation. This suited him perfectly. While Blair blundered about interrogating innocent crofters and antagonising everyone within reach, Hamish could conduct his own inquiries in the manner that had always served him best, quietly and with a good deal of tea. His first stop was the home of the Curry twins, Nessie and Jessie, and two spinsters who lived in a neat cottage overlooking the harbour. Between them they knew everything that happened in Lochdu, though extracting information required patience and a tolerance for repetition. Nessie answered the door, peering at him through her spectacles. "It's the constable," she announced to her sister. "The constable," Jessie echoed from somewhere inside. Come in," said Nessie. "You'll be wanting to know about the murder." "About the murder," Jessie confirmed, appearing behind her sister like a mirror image. They ushered him into a sitting room so cluttered with antimacassars and china figurines that Hamish was afraid to move for fear of breaking something. A pot of tea appeared as if by magic, along with a plate of shortbread that Hamish suspected had been baked in anticipation of his visit. "Now then," said Nessie, settling herself in a chintz armchair, "what is it you want to know?" "Want to know," said Jessie. "I'm interested in Quentin Vane's movements before he died," Hamish said. "Did either of you see him that evening?" The sisters exchanged meaningful looks. "We saw him at the harbour," said Nessie. "Around 9 o'clock it was." 9 o'clock, Jessie confirmed. "And was he alone?" No, said Nessie, leaning forward conspiratorially. He was arguing with a young man, not from the village. Not from the village, Jessie repeated with relish. Hamish's interest sharpened. Can you describe him? 30s, I'd say, mused Nessie. Dark hair, expensive clothes. City clothes, you understand. City clothes, Jessie nodded. And what were they arguing about? Couldn't hear properly, Nessie admitted. But the young man was very agitated, kept pointing at Vane and raising his voice. Raising his voice? Jessie confirmed. Did you see where the young man went afterwards? Both sisters shook their heads in unison. He got into a car, said Nessie. A BMW, I think it was. A BMW, said Jessie. Hamish made a mental note to find out more about this mysterious visitor. He thanked the sisters and made his escape, taking a piece of shortbread for the road. His next visit was to Angus MacDonald, who lived in a cottage so remote that even the sheep avoided it. Angus was known throughout the Highlands as a seer, blessed with the second sight. Hamish, being of a practical turn of mind, considered him a shrewd old fraud who was nevertheless useful for his extensive network of gossips and relations. He found Angus sitting outside his cottage, smoking a pipe and gazing at the mountains as if they held secrets only he could read. I knew you'd be coming, Angus said without turning round. Did your second sight tell you that? Hamish asked dryly. Or did you see my Land Rover coming up the track? Angus cackled. You're a cynical man, Hamish Macbeth. But I heard about the murder. Bad business, that. What do you know about Quentin Vane? Only what everyone knows. He was a bad man doing bad work for a bad master. Angus puffed on his pipe thoughtfully. But I'll tell you something interesting. My cousin's daughter works at the hotel in Strathbane, where Vane was staying. She said he had a visitor the day before he died. A young man, very upset, demanding to see him. Dark hair, expensive clothes. Aye, that's the one. Made quite a scene in the lobby, apparently. Security had to escort him out. Hamish filed this information away. Anything else? The land remembers, Angus said mysteriously. That barn has seen sorrow before, and it will see it again. Hamish had learned not to press Angus when he went into his mystical mode. He thanked the old man and drove back toward Lochdoub, thinking hard. The young man was clearly important, but Blair would have to be told about him, and Blair would undoubtedly make a mess of it. Which meant Hamish needed more information before sharing what he had learned. Back in Lochdoub, he stopped at the harbour where Archie McLean was mending his nets. The fisherman looked up as Hamish approached, his weathered face wary. If you're here to arrest me, you can save your breath, Archie said. I didn't kill the man, though God knows I wanted to. I'm not here to arrest anyone, Hamish said mildly. I'm just trying to understand what happened. Archie's shoulders relaxed slightly. Well, the bastard was threatening to tell my wife about my whiskey fund. Had it all worked out, he did. How much I'd been setting aside where I kept it hidden. Said if I didn't support his development plans, he'd make sure she knew every penny. How did he find out? He had access to all the land records, didn't he? Found some old document that mentioned a stone where my great-grandfather used to hide his money from the excisemen. Same stone I've been using. Archie shook his head bitterly. Wife would have my guts for garters if she knew. When did he threaten you? The night before he died. Right here at the harbour it was. I told him where he could shove his threats, but he just laughed. Archie's hands tightened on the net. I'm not saying I'm sorry he's dead, Hamish, but I didn't kill him. Where were you that night? Archie's face went red. In the pub cellar, hiding from the wife after she'd had words with me about coming home late. Ask the barman, he'll tell you. It was exactly the sort of alibi that was embarrassing enough to be true. Hamish made a note to verify it. He was walking back to the police station when Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson pulled up in a patrol car. Jimmy was Blair's second in command, a decent enough fellow who had been ground down by years of serving under Blair's incompetent leadership. He was also partial to whiskey, a weakness Hamish had exploited on more than one occasion. Hamish, Jimmy greeted him. Blair's in a rare mood. Already has 3 suspects lined up for interrogation tomorrow. Based on what evidence? Based on the fact that they argued with Vane at the meeting. You know Blair. First person who looks guilty gets arrested. Evidence be damned, Hamish sighed. This was exactly what he had feared. Fancy a dram, Jimmy? I've got a bottle of the good stuff at the station." Jimmy's eyes lit up. "Well, now, that's very hospitable of you." 20 minutes later, they were settled in Hamish's kitchen, glasses of single malt whiskey in hand. Luggs had positioned himself between them, hoping for dropped food, while Sonsi regarded Jimmy with feline suspicion from her perch on top of the refrigerator. "So," Hamish said casually, "what's the autopsy saying?" Jimmy took a generous sip of whiskey. Death was instantaneous. A single blow to the back of the skull, delivered with considerable force. The weapon was definitely that old peat cutter found at the scene. No defensive wounds, which means he never saw it coming. Time of death? Between midnight and 2 in the morning, forensics found some interesting boot prints near the back door of the barn. Large size, heavy tread. They're running them through the database now. Hamish topped up Jimmy's glass. "Anything from Vane's room at the hotel?" "Now that's the interesting bit," Jimmy said, leaning forward. "We found a safe hidden behind a painting. Took us half the day to crack it. Inside was a ledger, Hamish, full of names and secrets. Vane wasn't just a consultant, he was blackmailing half the county." "Anyone from Lochdoub?" "Archie McLean, Dr. Brodie, and a few others." "Blair's convinced it's one of them," Jimmy shook his head. "He's planning mass arrests. It'll be a bloodbath." Hamish poured himself another whiskey and thought about innocent villagers being dragged through Blair's idea of justice. It was exactly the sort of disaster he had dedicated his life to avoiding. "I don't suppose," he said carefully, "you'd let me have a look at that ledger?" Jimmy laughed. "Blair would have my badge, but I might have made a few notes, for my own records, you understand." He pulled out a folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. Hamish unfolded it and scanned the contents, his expression growing grimmer with each line. Vane had been thorough. Every secret, every small deception meticulously recorded. It was a map of human weakness, and it gave half the village a motive for murder, which meant that finding the real killer was going to be considerably more difficult than he had hoped. "Thanks, Jimmy," he said quietly. "Just don't let Blair know where you got it." Jimmy stood, swaying slightly. "I better be getting back before he notices I'm gone." After Jimmy left, Hamish sat in the gathering darkness, the list of names before him. Somewhere in this tangle of secrets and lies was the truth. He just had to find it before Blair arrested the wrong person, or persons. Chapter 4. The Extortionist Ledger. Hamish spent the next morning doing what he did best, appearing to do very little while actually accomplishing a great deal. He made a show of patrolling the village in his Land Rover, stopping frequently to chat with locals and reassure them that Blair's threatened mass arrests were unlikely to materialise. What he didn't mention was that he had no actual power to prevent Blair from doing whatever foolish thing Blair decided to do. But the villagers didn't need to know that. They needed to feel safe. And Hamish had long ago learned that a policeman's most important duty was making people feel protected, even when the real threat came from his own superiors. The official autopsy report arrived by fax just after lunch. Hamish read it while eating a cheese sandwich, Luggs watching hopefully for fallen crumbs. The medical examiner confirmed what Jimmy had already told him. A single, devastating blow from behind, delivered with enough force to fracture the skull and cause immediate death. No signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. The victim had been completely unaware of his attacker, which suggested either that Vane had known his killer and felt no threat, or that the killer had approached with remarkable stealth. Hamish was contemplating this when his telephone rang. It was the hotel manager in Strathbane, a nervous man named Douglas who had been at school with Hamish's cousin. "Mr. Macbeth? I thought you should know. That detective from Strathbane, the fat one with the red face. He's been through Mr. Vane's room like a tornado. Made a terrible mess. But he missed something." "Oh, I? There's a cupboard in the bathroom behind the towels. I found it when I was cleaning up. A leather portfolio pushed right to the back. Shall I bring it to the Strathbane station?" "No," said Hamish quickly. "I'll come and collect it myself. Police business, you understand. Best to keep it quiet." He drove to Strathbane with a sense of anticipation that he told himself was purely professional. Blair had already found the safe and the ledger. What else could Vane have been hiding? The portfolio was expensive, the kind of thing a man like Vane would carry to impress clients. Inside were property surveys, land registry documents, and a series of photographs that made Hamish's eyebrows rise. They showed the old Angus barn from various angles, but also detailed shots of the surrounding land, with measurements and notes scrawled in the margins. But it was the last document that caught his attention. A deed of sale, unsigned and undated, transferring ownership of the barn and the surrounding 5 acres from Lord Strathmore to a development company based in London. Vane's signature was already on it, listed as a director of the company, so that was his game. Vane hadn't just been hired to assess the land. He'd been planning to buy it himself, demolish the barn, and develop the site for profit. The agricultural efficiency scheme had been nothing more than a cover story. Hamish photographed the documents with his mobile phone and left the portfolio with Douglas, who promised to keep it secure. On the drive back to Lochdu, he considered what this meant. Vane's plan would have destroyed not just the barn, but the entire character of that part of the village. The man had been even more despicable than anyone had realised. He was passing through the village when he spotted a car he didn't recognise. A dark blue BMW parked outside the Lochdub Hotel. On impulse, Hamish pulled over and went inside. The hotel's proprietor, a cheerful woman named Mrs. MacLeod, greeted him warmly. "Constable, what brings you here?" "That BMW outside. Who does it belong to?" "Oh, that's Mr. Vane's nephew. Callum Vane, he said his name was. Checked in this morning. Terrible business about his uncle, isn't it?" "Did he say what brought him to Lochdub?" Mrs. MacLeod lowered her voice conspiratorially. "He's here for the funeral arrangements, he says, but between you and me, he seems more interested in his uncle's belongings. Asked me 3 times if the police had taken everything from the room." Hamish felt a tingle of interest. "Is he in now?" "Up in room 7. Shall I call him down?" No, just curious." "Thank you, Mrs. MacLeod." But as Hamish left the hotel, he nearly collided with a young man hurrying out, dark-haired, well-dressed, with the harried look of someone under considerable stress. Their eyes met briefly before the young man pushed past and climbed into the BMW. "Mr. Vane?" Hamish called out. The young man froze, his hand on the car door. "Yes?" "I'm Police Constable Macbeth. I wonder if I might have a word." Callum Vane's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, fear, and then a careful blankness. "I'm rather busy at the moment. Perhaps later." "It won't take long. Just a few questions about your uncle. I barely knew the man. We weren't close." "Yet you're here to arrange his funeral?" Callum's jaw tightened. "Family obligation. Look, Constable, I've already spoken to that detective from Strathbane, the one who thinks everyone's a criminal. I've told him everything I know, which is precisely nothing. When did you last see your uncle?" "I haven't seen him in 3 years." "That's odd," Hamish said mildly, "because you were seen arguing with him at the Strathbane Hotel 2 days before he died." Callum's carefully composed expression cracked. "Who told you that?" "It's a small world, Mr. Vane, especially in the Highlands. People notice strangers." For a moment, Hamish thought the young man might simply drive away. Then Callum's shoulders sagged. "All right. Yes, I saw him. We argued. He owed me money. A lot of money. My father's inheritance, which Quentin was supposed to be managing. Instead, he'd been using it to fund his property schemes." "Did you get your money?" "He laughed in my face. Said I should take him to court if I had the nerve." Callum's hands clenched into fists. "But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking. I went back to Edinburgh that same night. I can prove it." "I'm sure you can," Hamish said, "but I'll need to verify it. Where were you between midnight and 2 o'clock on the night he died?" "At home. Alone. Not much of an alibi, I know." "It's better than no alibi at all. Do you have any idea who might have wanted to harm your uncle?" Callum laughed, a bitter sound. "Based on what I've heard, you could fill a phone book. My uncle was a parasite, Constable. He found people's weaknesses and exploited them. He probably had enemies in every county." After Callum drove off, Hamish stood in the street thinking. The nephew had a strong motive and no real alibi. But there was something about his anger that rang true. If Callum had killed his uncle, he would have done it in Strathbane, where the body might not be found for days. Coming to the remote highlands and committing murder in a village full of witnesses made no sense, unless of course that was exactly what Callum wanted him to think. Back at the police station, Hamish updated his notes and fed Lugs and Sonsey, who had been engaged in one of their periodic territorial disputes over the armchair. The Wildcat had won, as she always did. Nay, he was making himself a cup of tea when there was a knock at the door. Elspeth Menzies stood on the doorstep, holding a covered dish. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Constable," she said. "I made too much stew and thought you might like some. You must be so busy with the investigation." "That's very kind of you, Elspeth." She came in and set the dish on the kitchen table, then hesitated. "I heard that awful detective from Strathbane is planning to arrest Archie. Is it true?" "Where did you hear that?" "Village talk. You know how it is. But surely Archie couldn't have done it. He's such a gentle soul, really." Hamish studied her carefully. Elspeth's gentle grey eyes met his with perfect sincerity. Her concern for Archie seemed genuine, but there was something about her timing. Sus always appearing with food or help exactly when it might be most distracting, that made him uneasy. "I wouldn't worry too much about village talk," he said. "Blair hasn't arrested anyone yet." "Oh, that's a relief." She smiled, that shy, self-effacing smile that made people want to protect her. "I'll let you eat your dinner in peace. Good evening, Constable." After she left, Hamish sat down with the stew, which was excellent, and thought about helpful people who appeared at convenient times. Sometimes, he reflected, the most dangerous people were the ones everyone trusted. Chapter 5. Expanding the suspect pool. The weather turned nasty again overnight, with wind howling down from the mountains and rain lashing against the windows of the police station. Hamish woke to find Sonsey curled against his feet, a rare concession to companionship that the Wildcat only made during the worst storms. Even she had her limits. He was frying eggs for breakfast when Blair telephoned, his voice thick with triumph and what sounded suspiciously like an early morning whisky. "Macbeth, I've cracked it. Get yourself over to Strathbane. We're making an arrest within the hour." Hamish's heart sank. "Who are you arresting?" "Archie McLean. The boot prints match his Wellingtons perfectly. Size 11, heavy fisherman's boots, plus he had motive. Vane was threatening to expose him to his wife." "That's hardly sufficient evidence for murder, sir." "Don't tell me how to do my job, Constable. The man argued with the victim. He has no alibi worth speaking of, and his boots were at the scene. That's good enough for me." The line went dead. Hamish stood holding the receiver, watching his eggs burn. This was exactly what he had feared. Blair, desperate for a quick arrest and good headlines, was about to destroy an innocent man's life. He turned off the stove and reached for his jacket. If he couldn't stop Blair, he could at least make sure Archie had proper legal representation. But as he opened the door, he found Dr. Brodie standing on the step, looking decidedly uncomfortable. "Hamish," the doctor said, "I need to speak with you, in confidence." Doctor. Brodie was a solid man in his 50s, with iron-grey hair and the steady hands of someone who had spent decades setting broken bones and delivering babies. But this morning, those hands were trembling. "Come in," Hamish said, standing aside. The doctor refused tea and stood by the window staring out at the rain. "I heard Blair is arresting Archie." "Aye, within the hour." "Then I need to tell you something. About Quentin Vane." Dr. Brodie turned, his face haggard. "He was blackmailing me." Hamish gestured to a chair. "You'd better sit down and tell me the whole story." The doctor sank into the chair as if his legs could no longer support him. 5 years ago I made a mistake. A patient came to me with chest pains. I diagnosed indigestion and sent her home. She died that night. A heart attack. "These things happen," Hamish said gently. "You're not infallible." "The medical board investigated. They cleared me. Said I'd followed proper procedure, that the symptoms were ambiguous, but I've lived with the guilt ever since." Dr. Brodie's voice cracked. "Vane found the record somehow. He threatened to make them public, to contact the woman's family, to drag the whole thing through the newspapers. Said he'd ruin what was left of my career unless I supported his development plans. What did you do? I told him to go to hell, but I was frightened, Hamish. Terrified, actually. If the family sued, if the story got out... He shook his head. I've been a wreck since he arrived. Where were you the night he died? Playing cards with Reverend Wellington and 2 of the church elders. We meet every Wednesday. Finished around midnight, then I went straight home. My wife can confirm it. Hamish made a note. Did you go anywhere near the old Angus barn? No. Why would I? Someone saw you there, a few nights ago, carrying a burlap sack. Dr. Brodie's face went scarlet. That. I was hoping no one had noticed. What was in the sack? The doctor squirmed. Promise you won't arrest me? That depends on what you were doing. I caught a salmon in the river without a license. The words came out in a rush. It was a beautiful fish, Hamish, and I couldn't resist. But then I panicked. My wife's brother is a bailiff. If he found out I'd been poaching, I'd never hear the end of it. So I buried it behind the barn. Despite the gravity of the situation, Hamish had to suppress a smile. A respected physician terrified of his brother-in-law, sneaking around in the dark to hide an illegal fish. It was exactly the sort of absurdity that made Highland life simultaneously frustrating and endearing. I'll not be arresting you for a salmon, Hamish said, but you should have come to me sooner about Vane's blackmail. I know. I was ashamed and frightened. After the doctor left, Hamish sat at his desk and added Dr. Brodie's name to his list of suspects with motives. Then he reluctantly crossed it off. The alibi was too solid, and somehow he couldn't picture the good doctor sneaking up behind Vane and crushing his skull. Dr. Brodie saved lives. He didn't take them. The telephone rang again. This time it was Jimmy Anderson speaking in a whisper. Hamish, thought you should know. Blair's got Archie in an interview room. It's no going well. I'm coming over. There's something else. We've traced that nephew, Callum Vane. Traffic cameras show his car on the A9, heading south, at midnight on the night of the murder. He's 50 miles away at the time of death. Alibi solid. Another name crossed off the list. Hamish drove to Strathbane through sheeting rain, his mind working through the puzzle. The boot prints were damning, but they could have been planted. Someone could have taken Archie's Wellingtons, worn them to the barn and returned them. It was the sort of cunning detail a clever killer would think of. At Strathbane Station, he found chaos. Blair had apparently arrested Archie with maximum drama, dragging him out of his house in handcuffs while his wife screamed at the constables. The fisherman was now in an interview room, loudly protesting his innocence. Hamish slipped past the commotion and found Jimmy in the corridor. He's refusing to talk without a lawyer, Jimmy said. Blair's furious. Good for Archie. What about the boots? Forensics confirm they match the prints at the scene, but here's the interesting bit. There's no blood on them, no soil that matches the barn floor. Nothing. So someone wore them to make the prints, then cleaned them and returned them. That's my thinking, but try telling Blair that. Hamish peered through the interview room window. Archie sat with his arms folded, his weathered face set in stubborn lines. Blair loomed over him, red-faced and shouting. This is going to end badly, Hamish muttered. Aye, Jimmy agreed, for all of us. As if to prove his point, Blair emerged from the interview room. We are slamming the door behind him. He spotted Hamish and jabbed a finger in his direction. This is your fault, Macbeth. Your coddling of these people has made them think they're above the law. Well, I've got my man, and he's going to trial whether you like it or not. On what evidence? Boot prints that could have been planted and a motive half the village shares. The boots are in his house. How do you explain that? Someone borrowed them. It's a small village, sir. People don't lock their doors. Anyone could have taken them. Blair's face turned an alarming shade of purple. Get out of my station, Macbeth. This is a Strathbane investigation now. You're officially off the case. Hamish drove back to Lockdube in a foul mood. Being taken off the case was probably Blair's greatest gift. Since it meant Hamish could now investigate without official interference. But Archie was still in custody, and an innocent man's freedom hung in the balance. He was passing the library when he saw Elspeth Menzies locking the door. On impulse, he pulled over. "Elspeth, a word." She turned, smiling. "Of course, Constable. How can I help?" "You knew Vane was blackmailing people. Did anyone ever talk to you about it? Confide in you?" Her smile faltered. "Oh, no. I mean, I knew he was unpleasant, but blackmail? That's terrible." "You seem to know everything that happens in this village. Surely you heard something." For the first time, Elspeth looked flustered. "I really don't gossip, Constable. I prefer to mind my own business." It was such an obvious lie that Hamish almost called her on it. But something made him hold back. Instead, he thanked her and drove away, watching her in his mirror. She stood in front of the library, no longer smiling, her face unreadable. And Hamish had the sudden, certain feeling that Elspeth Menzies knew far more than she was telling. The question was, what and why? Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. Hamish spent a sleepless night turning the case over in his mind. By morning, he had decided that the only way to free Archie was to find the real killer. Blair would never admit he'd arrested the wrong man unless presented with incontrovertible proof, preferably tied up with a bow and delivered on a silver platter. The problem was that every suspect he'd identified so far had either a solid alibi or insufficient motive. Callum Vane was 50 miles away. Dr. Brodie was playing cards with the minister. Archie himself was hiding in a pub cellar from his wife. It was like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where all the pieces came from different boxes. He was feeding the chickens when he noticed something odd. The old Angus barn was visible from his croft house, and even at this distance, he could see a figure moving near the back entrance. Hamish set down the feed bucket and fetched his binoculars. It was Dr. Brodie, and he was carrying a spade. Hamish's policeman's instincts, rusty from disuse but still functional, immediately went on alert. He climbed into his Land Rover and drove toward the barn, taking a roundabout route that would bring him up from behind. The last thing he wanted was to spook the doctor into doing something foolish. He parked behind a stand of trees and approached on foot, moving quietly despite his height. The barn's back door was ajar, and through it he could hear the sound of digging. Hamish eased the door open and slipped inside. Dr. Brodie was bent over a shallow hole in the corner of the barn, his back to the door. The burlap sack lay beside him, and even from here, Hamish could smell the unmistakable odour of rotting fish. "Dr. Brodie," Hamish said quietly. The doctor spun around with a yelp, nearly dropping the spade. When he saw Hamish, his face went through a remarkable range of expressions: shock, guilt, relief, and finally resignation. "Oh, for heaven's sake," he muttered. "I suppose you think I'm here destroying evidence." The thought had crossed my mind. "It's the damned salmon!" Dr. Brodie gestured at the sack with disgust. I couldn't sleep, worrying that someone would find it and think, "Well, think exactly what you're thinking." So I came to move it somewhere less incriminating. Hamish walked over and nudged the sack with his boot. It was indeed a salmon, and judging by the smell, it had been dead for several days. "You buried it here the night of the murder?" "The night before? Well, actually, I caught it that afternoon, panicked, and brought it here after dark. I thought the barn was far enough from the main road that no one would notice. And you didn't think to mention this when Vane was found dead in the very same barn?" The doctor had the grace to look ashamed. "I realise now how it looks. But I swear to you, Hamish, I didn't kill anyone. I'm a doctor. I save lives, not end them." Hamish studied him carefully. Dr. Brodie met his gaze without flinching, his face open and honest. Either he was telling the truth, or he was the best liar Hamish had ever encountered. "Right," Hamish said finally. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to rebury that fish exactly where you found it. Then you're going to go home and forget this ever happened, and I'm going to pretend I was never here." Dr. Brodie blinked. "You're not going to arrest me for poaching during a murder investigation?" Hamish shook his head. "I've got better things to do. Besides, that salmon suffered enough indignity. Let it rest in peace." The doctor's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Hamish. I owe you one." Just don't let your brother-in-law find out. I'll not be able to help you with that." After Dr. Brodie had hurriedly reburied his contraband and scurried away, Hamish remained in the barn looking around with fresh eyes. The morning light slanted through gaps in the walls, illuminating dust motes and the dark stain where Vane had fallen. The blood had seeped into the earth, leaving a shadow that would probably never fully fade. He walked slowly around the perimeter, noting the layout. The barn was larger than it appeared from outside, with old farming equipment stored along one wall and hay bales stacked against another. Someone unfamiliar with the space would have stumbled in the darkness, but the killer had navigated it perfectly, finding both the victim and the murder weapon without fumbling, which meant they knew the barn well. Very well indeed. Hamish was examining the spot where the peat cutter had been found when his mobile phone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson, and he sounded agitated. "Hamish, Blair's lawyer just called. Archie's solicitor is making noise about unlawful arrest. Says we don't have enough evidence to hold him past 48 hours. That's because you don't." "Aye. Well, Blair's not seeing it that way. He's demanding we find more evidence, and he's not particular about where it comes from. If you take my meaning." Hamish took his meaning perfectly. Blair was desperate enough to manufacture evidence if necessary. "Tell him I might have something, but I need to check it first." "What sort of something?" "I'll let you know. Just keep him away from Archie for another day." Hamish rang off and stood thinking. What he needed was to shake loose some information, to rattle someone into making a mistake. The problem was that he couldn't rattle Blair's official suspects without Blair finding out. But there was one person who hadn't been officially questioned yet. He drove back to the village and went directly to the library. It was housed in a converted church hall, all dark wood and musty books. Elspeth was at the front desk, cataloguing new arrivals. She looked up as he entered, her smile automatic but not quite reaching her eyes. "Constable Macbeth. 2 visits in 2 days. I'm honoured." "I need to see the village archives," Hamish said. "Specifically any records relating to the old Angus barn." Something flickered across Elspeth's face, too quick to identify. "Of course. May I ask why?" "Just following up on something. You mentioned Vane was researching historical deeds?" "Did I?" Elspeth's voice was carefully neutral. "Yes, I suppose he was. Though I'm not sure what good old land records will do in a murder investigation. You'd be surprised what turns up in old records." She led him to a back room where filing cabinets lined the walls. The air smelled of aging paper and dust. Elspeth pulled open a drawer and extracted a folder. "These are all the documents we have relating to that property. Deeds, surveys, photographs. Some of them go back 200 years. Hamish opened the folder and began leafing through. Most of it was exactly what Elspeth had described. Dry legal documents detailing property transfers and boundary disputes. But tucked near the back was a photograph from the 1950s, showing the barn in its prime, with a family standing proudly in front of it. "Who are these people?" he asked. Elspeth glanced at the photo. "I'm not sure. Before my time." It was another lie. Hamish could see it in the way she wouldn't meet his eyes, in the slight tremor of her hand as she closed the filing cabinet. She knew exactly who they were. "Can I borrow this folder?" he asked. "Of course. Just sign it out." As he filled in the logbook, Hamish noticed that Vane's name appeared several times in recent entries. He had been researching the barn's history extensively. But there was another name that appeared even more frequently, going back years. Elspeth's own. "You've done a lot of research on this barn yourself," he observed. "It's an important part of village history. I like to keep our records complete." "Aye, very thorough of you." He left with the folder under his arm, aware that Elspeth was watching him go. Outside, the wind had picked up again, bringing the smell of rain from the mountains. Hamish sat in his Land Rover and studied the photograph. The family in the picture looked happy, prosperous even. The man had his arm around his wife, and a young girl stood between them, smiling shyly at the camera. There was something familiar about that shy smile, something that nagged at the edge of Hamish's memory. He pulled out his phone and called Angus MacDonald. "Angus, I need you to use that mystical sight of yours, or failing that, your extensive network of gossipy relatives. What is it you need to know? I need you to find out who used to own the old Angus barn, before Lord Strathmore's family bought it. Go back 50, 60 years if you have to. That's a long time, Hamish. I know, but it's important. There was a pause. The land remembers, Angus said softly. Aye, I'll make some calls. Hamish drove back to the police station, the photograph on the seat beside him. Somewhere in Lochdoob's past was the answer to its present troubles. He was sure of it. He just had to dig deep enough to find it. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. Angus MacDonald called back just after lunch, his voice crackling over a poor connection. You've stirred up the past, Hamish Macbeth. My cousin in Inverness remembers the family. Name was Morrison. Duncan Morrison owned that barn and the land around it. Had a small business, importing goods from the continent. Did well for himself until the early 70s. What happened then? Went bankrupt. There was some sort of business deal that went bad. Duncan took his own life not long after. Left a wife and a daughter, both of them destitute. The land was sold to pay the debts and the family disappeared. Nobody knows what became of them. Hamish felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The daughter, do you know her name? My cousin thinks it was Elizabeth, or maybe Elspeth. Memories know what it was. After he rang off, Hamish sat staring at the photograph. The shy girl standing between her parents was perhaps 7 or 8 years old. If she was still alive, she'd be in her late 30s now, about the same age as Elspeth Menzies. But Menzies wasn't a Highland name. It could easily have been adopted, a way to hide one's past in a village where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Hamish needed to verify Archie's alibi before he could move forward. He found the fisherman's wife, Mrs. McLean, hanging washing on a line behind her cottage. She was a formidable woman with iron-grey hair and a tongue that could strip paint. Mrs. McLean, I need to ask you about the night Quentin Vane died. Come to arrest me too. Have you? She snapped a sheet with enough force to make it crack like a whip. First they take my husband, now they'll take me. Well, I'll tell you what I told that fat fool from Strathbane. Archie was hiding from me that night, the coward. Where was he hiding? In the pub cellar, I eventually found out. Drinking away our money while I worried myself sick. Her face softened slightly. But he didn't kill anyone, Constable. Archie's too soft for that. Won't even kill the mice that get into the shed. Traps them and releases them by the river. You're certain he was in the pub cellar all night? The barman confirmed it. Said Archie climbed down there around 9 and didn't come up until dawn. Fell asleep on a barrel of ale, the fool. Hamish thanked her and drove to the pub where the barman, a taciturn man named Willie, grudgingly confirmed the story. Archie had indeed spent the entire night in the cellar, too frightened of his wife to venture home, so Archie was innocent. Dr. Brodie had been playing cards with witnesses until midnight, then gone straight home. Callum Vane was on camera 50 miles away. Every suspect Hamish had identified was accounted for, except one. He drove to Reverend Wellington's manse, a solid stone house near the church. The minister's wife, Mrs. Wellington, answered the door with her usual bustling efficiency. "Hamish, come in, come in. You'll be wanting to speak to my husband, I expect. He's in his study." Reverend Wellington was a large, kindly man who'd served the parish for 20 years. He greeted Hamish warmly and offered tea, which Hamish accepted. "I need to verify, Doctor." Brodie's whereabouts on Wednesday night," Hamish said. "I understand you were playing cards." "That's right. Brodie, myself and 2 of our church elders, Malcolm Grant and Peter Ross. We meet every Wednesday without fail. It's our one indulgence." The minister smiled. "Penny ante poker. Nothing that would scandalise the congregation." "What time did you finish?" "Around midnight, as always. Brodie left first, said he was tired. The rest of us had a dram of whiskey and discussed parish business for another half hour." "And you're certain of the time?" "Absolutely. Mrs. Wellington is quite strict about me being home by midnight. She was waiting up when I arrived, I'm afraid. Something about a leaking tap that needed immediate attention." Another alibi confirmed. Hamish thanked the minister and left. His mind working through the implications. If all the obvious suspects were innocent, then the killer was someone who had remained hidden in plain sight. Someone who had access to the village, to the barn, to Archie's boots. Someone who could move through Loughdoob without raising suspicion. He was driving past the library when he saw Elspeth locking up for the day. On impulse, he pulled over again. "Elspeth, do you have a moment?" She turned, and for just a second her pleasant mask slipped. Hamish saw something in her eyes that made him certain he was on the right track. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. "Of course, Constable. How can I help?" "I've been looking at the old archives. Interesting family history connected to that barn." "Oh?" Her voice was carefully neutral. "The Morrisons. Do you know anything about them?" "Only what's in the records. They owned the property before the Strathmores. Some sort of business failure, I believe. The daughter would be about your age now." Elspeth's smile didn't waver, but her fingers tightened on her handbag. "I wouldn't know. As I said, it was before my time." "Aye, of course." Hamish paused. "It's just that I found it interesting how much research you've done on that particular property. Years' worth of research, according to the library logs. I research many properties. It's my job." "True enough." Hamish gestured at the library. "You've been the archivist here for how long?" 15 years. "And before that?" For the first time, Elspeth looked genuinely rattled. "I lived in Edinburgh, worked in a bookshop. Is this relevant to the investigation?" "Constable?" "Probably not," Hamish said easily. "I'm just curious by nature. Always have been." He tipped his cap and drove away, watching her in the mirror. She stood on the pavement, her face pale in the fading light, no longer smiling. Back at the police station, Hamish called Jimmy Anderson. "Jimmy, I need you to run a background check. Elspeth Menzies, currently residing in Loughdoob. I want to know where she came from, what her real name is, and whether she has any connection to a family called Morrison." "Elspeth?" Jimmy sounded surprised. "The sweet wee librarian?" "That's the one. And Jimmy, don't mention this to Blair, not yet. You think she's involved?" "I think she knows more than she's telling. Maybe a lot more." After he hung up, Hamish made himself dinner and fed his animals, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept coming back to that photograph, to the shy girl who looked so much like the helpful woman who had brought him scones and coffee and stew. The woman who had been so eager to provide Blair with lists of suspects. The woman who had been researching the barn's history for years. What had Vane discovered that made him a threat? And what had pushed gentle Elspeth Menzies to murder? The telephone rang just as Hamish was settling into his armchair. It was Jimmy, his voice tense. "Hamish, you were right. Elspeth Menzies was born Elizabeth Morrison, changed her name by deed poll 20 years ago. Her father was Duncan Morrison, who owned the Old Angus barn until he went bankrupt and killed himself in 1972. Does Blair know? Not yet, but there's more. I pulled Vane's phone records. He called Elspeth's mobile 3 times the day before he died. The last call was at 11:30 that night." Hamish felt his pulse quicken. What did they talk about? No idea, but one of those calls lasted 15 minutes. That's a long conversation for someone who claimed she barely knew the man. After Jimmy rang off, Hamish sat in the darkness, thinking. Elspeth had lied about knowing Vane. She had lied about her research. She had probably lied about everything, and somewhere in those lies was the key to the murder. He looked at Lugs, who was watching him with concerned blue eyes. "Tomorrow," Hamish told the dog, "we're going to have another chat with Miss Elspeth Menzies, and this time I'm not leaving until I get the truth." Lugs whined softly, as if he understood the stakes. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. In the distance, the Old Angus barn stood dark against the sky, keeping its secrets. But not for much longer. Hamish Macbeth was patient, but he was also persistent, and in his experience, persistence always won in the end. Even when dealing with sweet-faced librarians who hid murder behind their gentle smiles. Chapter 8. The Archivist's Flaw. Hamish spent the rest of the day digging into Elspeth Menzies' past. which turned out to be remarkably difficult. She had appeared in Lochdoub 15 years earlier, taken the position at the library, and settled into village life as if she had always been there. But there were gaps, inconsistencies in her story that only became apparent when examined closely. He started with the obvious. Birth records. Elspeth claimed to have been born in Inverness, but there was no record of an Elspeth Menzies born in that city during the relevant years. He tried variations of the name, checked neighbouring counties, and came up empty. Then he tried a different approach. If Elspeth was really the Grant daughter, she would have been born under that name. He called Angus again. What was the daughter's name? The one who disappeared? There was a pause while Angus consulted with whoever was feeding him information. Elizabeth Grant, born in 1967, would be 58 now. Elspeth. Close enough to be believable, different enough to avoid immediate recognition. Hamish drove to Strathbane and spent several hours in the records office, pulling up everything he could find on Elizabeth Grant. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking. A young girl who had watched her father's business collapse, seen her family lose everything, witnessed her father's suicide. She had been placed in foster care after her mother's death, bouncing between homes until she turned 18 and vanished from official records entirely, until she reappeared in Lochdoub 15 years ago, calling herself Elspeth Menzies. He was studying a school photograph of young Elizabeth Grant when his mobile rang. It was Jimmy Anderson again. "Hamish, you need to see this. Remember that list Elspeth gave Blair? The one with everyone who argued with Vane at the meeting? What about it?" I was comparing it to my own notes, and there's a discrepancy. She lists Archie as having threatened Vane directly, saying he'd make him regret it. But 3 other witnesses say Archie never said anything of the sort. He was angry, aye, but he didn't make threats. Hamish felt his stomach tighten. She embellished it. Or invented it outright. There's more. That threatening note supposedly written by Archie, the one she conveniently found tucked inside a library book and brought to us yesterday. Forensic says the paper and ink are modern, but the handwriting is a poor imitation. Someone tried to copy Archie's writing style but got it wrong. When did she bring you this note? Yesterday afternoon, right after Blair started talking about releasing Archie for lack of evidence. Perfect timing, isn't it? Too perfect. Elspeth had been subtly steering the investigation from the beginning, providing helpful information that just happened to point toward other suspects. And when Blair's case against Archie started to collapse, she had manufactured evidence to shore it up. Hamish thanked Jimmy and sat in his Land Rover thinking. The timing bothered him. Elspeth had brought him scones the morning after the murder. She had appeared at the barn with coffee for the freezing detectives. She had provided Blair with a detailed list of suspects, and all the while she had been calm, a helpful, the perfect witness. Too perfect. He drove back to Lochdoub and went straight to the library. It was late afternoon, and the building was empty except for Elspeth, who was shelving books in the history section. She looked up as he entered, and for just a moment her smile faltered. "Constable Macbeth. Back again? I'm beginning to think you're developing an interest in local history." "I am, actually." Hamish walked slowly between the shelves. "Particularly the history of the Grant family." Her hand stilled on the books. "The Grants? I don't recall you mentioning them before. They owned the old Angus barn before Lord Strathmore's family bought it, or rather, before it was taken from them through fraud. I'm not familiar with that story. It was a lie, and they both knew it." Hamish pulled out the photograph he had been carrying and laid it on the nearest table. "This is Alexander Grant, his wife Mary, and their daughter Elizabeth, taken in 1972, 5 years before Alexander hanged himself in that barn." Elspeth looked at the photograph, her face expressionless. "How tragic. But I'm not sure what this has to do with me. The daughter would be 58 now, about your age, and Elizabeth is very close to Elspeth." "Constable, if you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts." Hamish pulled out his notebook. "You told DCI Blair that Vane was researching a historical deed, a specific document about the barn's ownership, but that document was destroyed in a fire in 1983. How would you know Vane was researching it unless you knew it had existed in the first place? A muscle twitched in her jaw. I must have been mistaken about which document he was examining. And then there's the threatening note, the one you found yesterday and gave to the police, supposedly written by Archie McLean, but Archie's handwriting slants to the left, the note slants to the right. I simply found it and reported it. How was I to know if it was genuine? Because you wrote it yourself, Hamish kept his voice gentle. The same way you wrote the information on that list you gave Blair, making Archie's argument with Vane sound worse than it was. The same way you've been helpfully pointing us toward every suspect except yourself. Elspeth set down the book she was holding very carefully. When she looked up, saw her eyes were hard. You have quite an imagination, Constable. I also have forensics. There was archival glue on Vane's jacket, the specialised kind you use to preserve documents, and I have a witness who saw someone matching your description near the barn the night of the murder. That last part was a bluff, but Elspeth didn't know that. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. I want to show you something, Hamish said quietly. He pulled out another photograph, this one from the records office. It showed a young Elizabeth Grant at age 12, standing in front of the barn with her father. The resemblance to the adult Elspeth was unmistakable. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, she sank into a chair. He was going to demolish it, she whispered. That barn was all I had left of them. My father died there, but it was also where he taught me to ride a bicycle, where my mother and I would go to collect eggs from the chickens. It was home. So you killed him. She didn't deny it. Quentin Vane found out who I really was. He thought it was hilarious. The daughter of the man his father destroyed, living in the same village, working in the library. He said he was going to expose me, tell everyone about the theft. What theft? When I was 17, after my mother died, I stole money from one of my foster families. Not much, just enough to run away. They never pressed charges, but Vane found the record somehow. He said he'd make sure everyone knew. He said he'd get me fired, arrested, humiliated. Her voice hardened, just like his father humiliated mine. So you arranged to meet him at the barn. I told him I had documents that proved his father's fraud, that if he destroyed the barn I'd go public with them. He came to see them. She laughed bitterly. There were no documents, of course. They were destroyed years ago, but he didn't know that. And when he arrived, I was waiting. I'd taken Archie's boots from outside his house earlier that week, worn them to leave prints, then cleaned them and returned them. I knew the police would find the boot prints. I knew they'd arrest Archie or one of the others. I'd planned it all so carefully. She looked up at Hamish, her gentle mask completely gone. He didn't even see me. I was standing behind the door when he came in. One strike, and it was over. Justice. After all these years. That's not justice, Hamish said quietly. That's murder. Call it what you want. She stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that no longer trembled. Are you going to arrest me now? I am. Then let's get it over with. But I want you to know, Constable, I don't regret it. Not for a moment. Quentin Vane destroyed lives just like his father did. The world is better without him. Hamish looked at this woman who had fooled everyone with her shy smiles and helpful nature, and felt a deep sadness. She had let revenge consume her life, spending years planning and waiting for the right moment. And in the end, all she had accomplished was to destroy herself. I'll need you to come with me to the station, he said. Of course. Just let me lock up the library first. Can't leave it open. And even now, she gave him a sad smile, some habits die hard. As she gathered her coat and keys, Hamish reflected that this was the worst part of his job. Not catching criminals, but understanding why they became criminals in the first place. Sometimes the most dangerous people really were the ones everyone trusted. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. Hamish didn't take Elspeth to the station immediately. Instead, he suggested they sit down in the library's back room, away from any passers-by who might glance through the windows. He made tea because that was what one did in times of crisis, and because he needed time to think. Elspeth accepted the cup with a ghost of her former smile. "You're very kind, Constable, even now." "I'm trying to understand," Hamish said, settling into a chair across from her. "You've lived here for 15 years. You became part of the community. You helped people. Why throw it all away for revenge? You don't understand what it was like." Elspeth wrapped her hands around the teacup. "I was 10 years old when my father's business partner betrayed him. Edward Vane smiled to our faces while he was destroying everything my father had built. The contracts were legal, technically, just immoral. That wasn't Quentin's fault. No, but he was exactly like his father. Same arrogance, same contempt for ordinary people. When he arrived in Lochdubh, I recognised him immediately. I'd followed his career over the years, watched him make a fortune using the same tactics his father had used, ruining lives for profit." She took a sip of tea, her hand steady now. "I thought I could ignore him, let him do his assessment and leave. But then he started going through the archives, researching the property deeds. He found my parents' names on the old barn ownership records, and he started asking questions. When did he realise who you were?" "The day before he died. I made a mistake. Yeah, he asked about a particular document, and I told him it had been destroyed in a fire. But that fire wasn't common knowledge. Only someone with a personal connection to those records would have known about it." She smiled sadly. "He put it together quite quickly after that. Confronted me right here in this library." "What did he say?" "He was amused. Genuinely amused. He said it was poetic justice that the daughter of the man his father ruined was stuck in this nowhere village, working for pennies. Then he told me about the theft from my foster family. Said he'd make sure everyone knew about it unless I supported his development plans publicly." Hamish could picture it. Vain, arrogant and cruel, enjoying his power over someone he saw as beneath him. It was no wonder Elspeth had snapped. "The barn meant everything to you," he said quietly. "It was the last piece of them I had left. My mother used to take me there when I was small. She'd pack sandwiches and we'd have picnics in the hayloft. My father proposed to her in that barn, did you know that? It's in the old journals I've kept." Tears ran down her cheeks now. Quentin was going to demolish it, turn it into a processing facility. He was going to erase the last trace of my family's existence, and he thought it was funny. "So you decided to kill him?" "Not immediately. At first I just wanted him gone. But then I realised he'd never leave. He'd keep coming back, keep threatening me, keep destroying things. Just like his father." She wiped her eyes. "I started planning. I knew the barn's layout perfectly. I'd spent months measuring it, photographing it, documenting every detail for the archives. I knew where every beam was, where the old tools hung, where the floorboards creaked. The boot prints were clever. I borrowed Archie's Wellingtons one night while he was at the pub, wore them to make the prints, cleaned them and put them back. I knew the police would find the evidence. I knew they'd suspect Archie or one of the others Vane had blackmailed." She met his eyes. "I'm not proud of trying to frame innocent people, but I wasn't going to let my family's destroyer walk away unpunished." "What about the lantern?" For the first time, something like emotion crossed her face. "That was for my father. He always kept a lantern burning in the barn when he worked late. My mother would see the light from the house and know he was safe. I wanted Vane's body found with that same light burning, a reminder of what was destroyed." Hamish understood then. The theatrical staging, the careful placement of evidence, the symbolic use of the lantern. This wasn't just murder. It was a ritual, a closing of a circle that had been broken decades ago. "You know I have to arrest you," he said. "Yes, I know." She finished her tea and set the cup down. "Will you tell the village the truth about who I really am?" "I'll have to. It'll come out at trial anyway. They'll hate me for lying to them all these years." "They'll hate you for murder more," Hamish said bluntly, "but they'll also understand why. Highlanders have long memories for wrongs done to families." Elspeth stood and walked to the window, looking out at the village she had called home for 15 years. "I did love it here, you know. It wasn't all pretense. The people, the quiet life, the sense of community. I was happy, in my own way. until Quentin Vane arrived and reminded me of everything I'd lost. You could have left when he came, and let him win, let him destroy the barn without consequence." She shook her head. "No, some things are worth fighting for, even if it means losing everything else." Hamish thought about his own attachment to Loch-Dubh, his refusal to accept promotion because it would mean leaving this place he loved. He understood, perhaps more than he wanted to, the fierce loyalty to a specific piece of ground, the need to protect what mattered. But understanding didn't change what had to be done. "We should go," he said gently. "I need to call Strathbane." "Let them know I'm bringing you in." "Of course." Elspeth collected her coat and handbag with the calm efficiency of someone preparing for an ordinary errand. Then she paused. "Constable, will you do me one favour?" "That depends on what it is." "The barn. Don't let them demolish it now that Vane is dead. It should be preserved. For the village, if not for me." "I can't make any promises about that." "No, I suppose not." She smiled, and for a moment she was the helpful, gentle Elspeth everyone had known. "But you'll try, won't you? Because you understand about places mattering more than people sometimes." Hamish didn't answer, because she was right and they both knew it. They walked out of the library together, Elspeth locking the door behind them with careful precision. A few villagers passed by, calling greetings that Elspeth returned with perfect normalcy. They had no idea they were watching a murderer being taken into custody. At the police station, Hamish made the necessary calls while Elspeth sat quietly in his office, stroking Sonsi, who had taken an uncharacteristic liking to her. Even the wildcat, it seemed, could be fooled by a gentle manner. Blair arrived within the hour, bursting through the door with his usual bluster. "Macbeth, what's this nonsense about you solving my case?" "It's not your case anymore, sir. I'm arresting Elspeth Menzies for the murder of Quentin Vane." Blair's face went through several shades of red before settling on puce. "The librarian? You expect me to believe the librarian is a murderer? She's confessed. Where's your evidence?" Hamish handed over the file he'd prepared, the birth records showing Elizabeth Grant, the connection to the barn, the archival glue found on Vane's jacket, the forged threatening note, the manipulated witness list. He'd even included a small sample of the same archival glue from Elspeth's supplies for comparison. Blair flipped through it, his expression growing more sour with each page. "This is circumstantial at best." "She confessed," Hamish repeated, "in front of witnesses. I recorded it on my mobile phone." He had done no such thing, but Blair didn't need to know that. Elspeth simply nodded in confirmation. "Fine," Blair snapped. "I'll take her into custody, but this better stick, Macbeth. Or it's your badge." After Blair had led Elspeth away, reading her rights with theatrical pomposity, Hamish sat alone in his office and felt thoroughly depressed. He'd solved the case, cleared Archie's name, and prevented an innocent man from going to prison. By any measure it was a success, so why did it feel like failure? Outside, the sun was setting over the loch, painting the water in shades of gold and red. The old Angus barn stood silhouetted against the sky, still standing despite everything. Hamish poured himself a dram of whisky and raised the glass toward the window. "To you, Elizabeth Grant," he said softly, "may you find peace, wherever you're going." But he doubted she would. Some sins, it seemed, were never fully paid for. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. The village of Loch-Dubh reacted to Elspeth's arrest with the sort of stunned disbelief usually reserved for natural disasters. The Curry twins took to their beds with the vapours. Archie McLean, released from custody with profuse apologies from an embarrassed police department, bought rounds at the pub for anyone who would listen to his tale of wrongful imprisonment. And Reverend Wellington gave a sermon about the unknowability of the human heart that left half the congregation in tears. Hamish kept to himself for the first few days, fielding telephone calls from reporters and deflecting questions from curious villagers. He had no desire to discuss the case or his role in solving it. The whole business left a sour taste in his mouth. It was nearly a week after the arrest when Jimmy Anderson appeared at the police station, bearing a bottle of whiskey and the latest news from Strathbane. "Blair's claiming full credit, of course," Jimmy said, settling into Hamish's armchair while Luggs immediately positioned himself for optimal petting. According to him, he solved the case through brilliant detective work, and you merely acted on his instructions. "That's fine by me. You're not angry?" "Why would I be? Blair taking the credit means I stay here instead of being promoted to Strathbane." Hamish poured 2 generous measures. "I count that as a victory," Jimmy laughed. "You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth. Most police would kill for the recognition." "Most police haven't met Strathbane," Hamish raised his glass. "Here's to remaining unambitious." They drank in companionable silence for a moment before Jimmy continued. "Elspeth's pleading guilty. Her solicitor tried to argue diminished capacity, but she won't have it. Says she knew exactly what she was doing and doesn't regret it. How long will she get? Life, probably, but with possibility of parole in 15 years if she behaves herself. The judge might show leniency given the circumstances." Jimmy scratched Luggs behind the ears. "Between you and me, there's some sympathy for her. Vane wasn't well liked, even in Strathbane." After Jimmy left, Hamish fed his animals and made himself dinner. The investigation was over, Archie was free, and justice had been served in the technical sense. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. The next morning, he received a telephone call from Lord Strathmore's estate manager, a brisk woman who informed him that his lordship had decided to donate the Old Angus barn to the village as a historical site. The planned development was cancelled. "His lordship feels," the woman said in tones that suggested she was reading from a prepared statement, "that recent events have highlighted the importance of preserving local heritage. The barn will be maintained by the village council for community use." Hamish suspected that Lord Strathmore's sudden attack of civic conscience had more to do with avoiding negative publicity than genuine historical interest. But the result was the same. The barn would be saved. He thought about telling Elspeth but decided against it. She would find out eventually, and he had no desire to reopen that particular wound. Life in Lochdoub slowly returned to normal. The reporters left when it became clear there were no more sensational revelations to be had. The villagers stopped gossiping about Elspeth and moved on to more immediate concerns, like Mrs. Wellington's disastrous attempt to organise a flower show. The murder became just another story in the village's long history, to be brought out and discussed on quiet evenings when the talk turned to past scandals. Hamish resumed his pleasant routine of minimal police work and maximum loafing. He tended his sheep, took Luggs for long walks along the loch, and generally avoided anything that might be construed as ambition. It was 3 weeks after Elspeth's arrest when he received a letter from her. It had been forwarded through her solicitor, and Hamish read it sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside him. The letter was brief and characteristically polite. She thanked him for his kindness during the arrest and apologised for any inconvenience she'd caused. She hoped the village wasn't suffering too badly from the scandal, and at the end, in a postscript that Hamish suspected was the real reason for the letter, she asked if the barn had been saved. He wrote back the same day, keeping his response equally brief. Yes, the barn had been preserved. The village council was planning to turn it into a heritage centre. Her parents' story would be part of the exhibition. He didn't mention that he had quietly suggested this to the council, or that he had provided them with the photograph of the Grant family standing proudly in front of their barn, whereas some things were better left unsaid. 2 days later, a package arrived from Strathbane. It contained Elspeth's personal effects from the library, forwarded by the council to the police station for disposal. Hamish went through them methodically. Books, photographs, knitting supplies, and at the bottom, a leather-bound journal. He almost set it aside unread, respecting her privacy even now. But curiosity got the better of him. The journal detailed her years in Lochdoub, written in her neat, precise hand. Page after page of village life, local history, observations about the people she had come to care for despite herself. And on the final page, written the night before Vane's murder, a single sentence. Tomorrow I reclaim what was stolen. Tomorrow the lantern burns again. Hamish closed the journal and sat for a long time, thinking about justice and revenge, about the sins of fathers visiting their sons, about the terrible price of holding on to grief for too long. Finally he stood and carried the journal to the fireplace. He lit the kindling and watched the flames catch. Then, without reading it again, he tossed the journal into the fire. Some confessions were meant to burn. He was standing at the window, watching the journal turn to ash, when his telephone rang. It was headquarters in Strathbane, and Hamish's heart sank as he recognised the voice of Superintendent Daviot. "Constable Macbeth, I wanted to personally commend you on your excellent work in the Vane case. Detective Chief Inspector Blair has spoken very highly of your assistance." Hamish suppressed a smile. Blair had no choice but to speak highly of him. Or since the alternative would be admitting that Hamish had solved the case Blair had bungled. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing my job." "Indeed, and that's why I'm pleased to inform you that you're being considered for promotion to Detective Sergeant. A position has opened up in Strathbane, and your name has been put forward." "That's very kind, sir, but I'm quite happy where I am." "Nonsense. This is a wonderful opportunity. I'll be in touch with the details next week." The line went dead. Hamish stood holding the receiver, feeling the familiar dread of impending upheaval. Then he smiled. He had avoided promotion before. He would avoid it again. All it would take was a little careful incompetence, a few well-timed mistakes, and perhaps a quiet word with Blair about how Hamish was far too lazy and insubordinate for advancement. Blair would be only too happy to agree. Outside, the evening sun gilded the loch, and smoke from cottage chimneys rose into the clear Highland air. In the distance, the old Angus barn stood solid and enduring, a monument to the past and a reminder that some things were worth preserving. Hamish poured himself a dram of whisky and broke off a piece of shortbread. Luggs looked up hopefully, and Hamish tossed him a bit. Sonsi, observing this favouritism, stalked over and received her own portion with regal condescension. "To Lochdew," Hamish said, raising his glass. "May it remain exactly as it is, and may I remain exactly where I am." The animals made no comment, being more interested in shortbread than philosophy. Hamish settled into his armchair, content in the knowledge that he had solved a murder, saved an innocent man, and, most importantly, avoided the terrible fate of a promotion to Strathbane. By his reckoning, that made it a successful case. The fact that a woman would spend years in prison for avenging her family's destruction troubled him, certainly. But the law was the law, and he was a policeman first and a philosopher second, or possibly third, after being lazy and avoiding responsibility. The evening deepened into night, and the lights of Lochdew winked on one by one, like stars reflected in the dark water of the loch. Somewhere in a prison cell Elizabeth Grant was beginning her sentence, and somewhere in the past Alexander Grant's ghost perhaps rested easier, knowing that his daughter had fought for their memory. Justice, Hamish reflected, was a complicated business, but then so was life in the Highlands. He finished his whisky, scratched Luggs behind the ears, and went to bed, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same blessed routine of minimal work and maximum contentment. Some things, he thought as he drifted off to sleep, were worth fighting for, and Lochdew was definitely one of them.